It was indeed a triumphant day to Mr. Bertram and Maria. Such a victory over Edmund's discretion had been beyond their hopes and was most delightful. There was no longer anything to disturb. I'm Harriet.
And I'm Ellen, and this is Reading Jane Austen.
This week, we're looking at chapters 17 to 21 of Mansfield Park. So let's start with your 100-word summary.
All right. This was one of those ones where I started off feeling, practically nothing happened, and then found it turned out to be quite large. Edmund discovers that Tom is still spending on theatrical equipment and inviting an audience. The actors, especially Mr. Rushworth, are soon full of complaints which they share with Fanny. Through rehearsals together, Henry raises Maria's hopes, and Edmund and Mary draw closer. Sir Thomas returns home unexpectedly and puts an end to the play. Mr. Yates lingers for the sake of Julia, but Henry departs immediately without a word to Maria. Sir Thomas, noticing Maria's distaste for Mr. Rushworth, offers to end their engagement, but she refuses, and to escape the dullness of home, soon marries. Julia accompanies the Rushworths on their honeymoon in Brighton.
Mine covers most of the same points, but some of the little bits you put in, I left out, and I put in some little bits that you didn't.
Well, that's why we have two.
Yeah, okay. Rehearsals begin and a scene painter is engaged. Henry and Maria rehearse a lot, making Mr. Rushworth jealous. Mary and Edmund independently come to Fanny's room for help rehearsing. At the first whole play rehearsal, Mrs. Grant can't be there, and Fanny agrees to read her part. But before her scene, Sir Thomas arrives home. Within a few days, he has restored the rooms and burned all the scripts. Henry and Yates both leave. Maria is devastated by Henry's departure. She marries Mr. Rushworth even though Sir Thomas offered to get her out of it, and Julia accompanies them to Brighton.
Yours is beautiful compared with mine.
You did get in some things I missed.
But it didn't read nicely.
Okay. I'd like to pick up on one of the things that was in your summary that I left out, which was the bit about everybody complaining to Fanny.
Yes.
Because that is just one of the things that makes the whole play scenario so funny. And I think the thing that G.B. Stern really engaged with when she was reading it as a child, the way everyone is unhappy about everything and complaining to Fanny, which of course parallels the scene in Persuasion where everybody is complaining to Anne.
Yes.
And somehow you don't quite picture Fanny as being such a person to talk to as Anne is. In Persuasion, Anne is very much part of the community. In Mansfield Park, Fanny feels so much on the outer, and yet suddenly we've got everyone complaining to her.
Up till now, what Fanny has been the little helper, the person who pops up when she's needed and does something. Yeah. But Fanny as sort of a sounding board, it's probably partly just a continuation.
Yeah.
If Fanny's there, people use her.
Yeah. It's interesting just looking overall at Fanny's involvement in the play. Like I said last time, I have changed my perspective on this, whereas previously I thought, hooray Fanny for upholding her principles and not being involved. But in fact, that's absolutely not the case. She has this thing against actually acting herself. She doesn't seem to have any issue with the play, except insofar as she sees more than anyone else of
what it's doing to Julia, yes.
And more importantly to Maria and Henry Crawford.
Oh, yes.
Because it does say that after the first rehearsal or two, Fanny began to be their only audience, and sometimes as prompter, sometimes as spectator was often very useful. It's again like the scene at Southerton, where Fanny is the only person who is seeing just what is happening between Henry Crawford and Maria.
Well, actually, that was one of the things that I was going to make a point about later, that she does not tell this to Edmund. She will argue back with Edmund, and we get examples of it. But once Edmund has said to her, no, there's nothing to worry about with Henry Crawford. If he seems to be favouring Maria, it shows that he's really interested in Julia.
Yeah.
And she says nothing about that, even to Edmund, right up to the time with Henry Crawford. And later on, you can see why she doesn't. But at this early stage, surely she could have said something to Edmund, and she didn't.
You could perhaps say, because she can see that Maria is behaving inappropriately given that she is engaged, Fanny doesn't want to feel like she's telling tales on Maria. Yeah.
You would have thought she would have said a certain amount between Southerton and the play. And she doesn't.
Yeah.
I don't find it odd. I just find it was probably a plot requirement.
Yeah. I do like that Fanny's involvement in the play is kind of bookended with these two beautiful quotes. First of all, after Edmund's joined in, it says, "She alone was sad and insignificant. She had no share in anything. She might go or stay. She might be in the midst of their noise or retreat from it to the solitude of the East Room without being seen or missed." So she starts out feeling quite sorry for herself and almost regretting that she's not part of it. But then later on, after she's been helping and people have been talking to her and she's been working with Mr. Rushworth on his lines, it then says, "The gloom of her first anticipation was proved to have been unfounded. She was occasionally useful to all. She was perhaps as much at peace as any." And I just think those are two nice authorial comments showing Fanny's relationship with the play.
I was coming at that one from another angle because I felt that that passage you started on was the beginning of us being shown the sort of moral trajectory that Fanny goes through in her head. Up till then, we've had Jane Austen, and perhaps on occasion slightly overdoing us, telling us about Fanny, about the terrible things that happened, how miserable she was when she left home.
Yeah.
And then in that passage, we see the way things happen in Fanny's mind and how all these feelings she has, she tries to deal with. You know, she was alone and sad and insignificant. There's Fanny doing self-pity.
Yes. Maybe some people respond negatively to it and think you brought this upon yourself, but I find it quite believable.
No, I think it's believable and we're meant to feel it with her. But what we see Fanny doing with it is Fanny starts off with self-pity and then she tries to get rid of that. She's now brought herself to sort of go in for all sorts of self-examination. She's starting to think, oh, look, I'm envying Mrs. Grant. I shouldn't be envying Mrs. Grant after all. And here she's doing humility. She was in danger of envying Mrs. Grant. And then, but reflection brought better feelings and showed her that Mrs. Grant was entitled to respect. So again, she's doing the sort of thing that Sir Thomas says
his daughters aren't doing.
They didn't have the less common acquirements of self-knowledge. And here we've got Fanny going in for self-knowledge. She's seen her self-pity. She's seen that it's not justified. And then she's got generosity as the other one. Mrs. Grant was entitled to respect, which could never have belonged to her. But finally she ends up with fitting this whole thing into the broad moral scheme, which is she could never have been easy in joining a scheme which, considering only her uncle, she must condemn altogether.
And then, of course, we do see in that other bit I read out about her being perhaps as much at peace as any. So we do see by applying this Christian self-reflection approach to herself, she has reached an equilibrium that many of the others haven't. She's not joining it in terms of taking part in the acting, but she is certainly facilitating it by helping everybody.
I think we've got this situation is she has to accept, I am supposed to be supportive of these people. I've been running around doing things for them for years. She doesn't say, I will have nothing to do with this.
But the other thing I wanted to bring up in that is part of the reason I've had this view for so many years that Fanny is holding out because of her principles is because what Edmund says when Sir Thomas gets back. We have all been more or less to blame, every one of us excepting Fanny. Fanny is the only one who has judged rightly throughout, who has been consistent. Her feelings have been steadily against it from first to last. She never ceased to think of what was due to you. You will find Fanny everything you could wish. Now,
that seems to me just nonsense.
Well, yes, but I think that is what has influenced my view of Fanny until I actually stepped back and read it closely. But also, Edmund, please be reasonable to Julia. Julia is the one who has stepped right away from it and disapproved of the whole. Her reasons are not reasons Sir Thomas would agree with or approve of, but Julia is the one who has had nothing to do with it.
Fanny's been almost the backbone of it in terms of getting people to know their lines and do their whinging away from one another. As far as I can see, what Fanny's done is what she's always felt was her job. My point I'm really wanting to make here is that we've got Jane Austen now moving into these interior investigations of Fanny, moving from, self-pity in this case, and taking herself through, forcing herself to step back and do the Christian thing, the right thing. And she does that over and over again with Fanny and makes it absolutely fascinating to see her being this character. That's what I've always thought with Fanny, and now I'm seeing how Jane Austen works it, that what I've loved was Fanny as this person who's always having feelings she disapproves of and fighting with them. And coming out doing something really quite acceptable.
And Jane Austen is also showing us the benefit of this is not just in her behaviour, but also in her inner equilibrium, her inner peace.
Yes, but showing that to a lot of people drives them mad.
That was most of what I had to say about the play and the rehearsals as such. Did you have anything else about that?
I just liked looking at Henry Crawford's behaviour after Sir Thomas arrives. The three Bertrams hightail it out of the room, leaving Mr. Rushworth is saying, should I go, can I go? And they're ignoring him. The moment he's gone, Henry Crawford takes over the situation. He tells Mr. Rushworth, yes, you follow them. He then says, we'll go back to the parsonage. Do you want to come with us, Mr. Yates? Mr. Yates says, no, I'll stay. But then he turns to Fanny and says to Fanny, will you tell the family that? Which gives Fanny the impetus she's been wanting to go there. He simply moves in and takes over the social situation.
I hadn't really thought of that, but yes, he picks up all the pieces, gathers it together, tells everyone what to do, and they do it. Except for Yates.
Yes.
The scene where Mary and Edmund come to Fanny's room. We tend to think of Mary as sort of smart and knowing and London and cool and in control of everything. But when she comes to Fanny's room, I don't think she's trying to achieve anything with Fanny. I think she is genuine in feeling uncomfortable about some of the lines she has to say. I did not think much of it at first, but upon my word, there, look at that speech, and that, and that. How am I ever to look him in the face and say such things? I think that's genuine.
Oh, yeah, I think so.
But I guess, whereas we see Maria takes the part of Agatha in spite of all the potential issues with it, and she runs with it, and she has no concern, she just does it. And Mary initially thought it would be lovely to play Amelia, but then she does actually have concerns. And of course, it's nice for the plot that Edmund then comes as well, and they can interact.
It's a lovely little bit of plot in amongst the comedy, because it's sort of comedy anyway. I would like to say something about that conversation between Mary and Mrs. Grant. Because there were a couple of nasty things with Mary. And she's got this outgoing, loving side. But Jane Austen is also prepared to give her this sort of let Henry get on with it side. She knows that he's made a big enough impression on Maria for her to want to break with Mr. Rushworth. And she doesn't care. She thinks, it's sport for Henry, let him get on with it.
Yes, we have, I rather wonder Julia is not in love with Henry, was her observation to Mary. I dare say she is, replied Mary coldly. I imagine both sisters are. And I do think that word coldly, I'm sure Jane Austen chose that word very, very specifically to give us probably a negative impression of Mary at this point.
Yes, there's the point where Mary said, you had better tell Miss Bertram to think of Mr. Rushworth. That's a beautiful one of Jane Austen showing the worst side of Mary.
She's basically just washing her hands of the situation.
It's worse than that. I often think of Mr. Rushworth's Property and Independence. And so what we've got there is Jane Austen is pulling up Mary's mercenary view of marriage, which is one of the things she holds against her.
Yeah.
In spite of being so loving to Fanny, when she sees her being hurt, she can sort of feel so coldly towards Maria.
Yeah. So one other thing to talk about, in the chapters we looked at today, we get to the end of Volume 1. And Volume 1 finishes with Julia rushing into the rehearsal saying that my father is come. He is in the hall at this moment. And I just think, as a cliffhanger ending, that is just amazing. Imagine if you'd got Volume 1 out of the circulating library, but you hadn't got Volume 2 yet, or someone else in the family was reading Volume 2, and you got to that, and you just desperately want to know what happens next.
Yes. One wonders if she deliberately did that in terms of length and so on, or was it just serendipitous?
Or did the publisher make the actual decision on where the breaks are?
Now, I tend to think she did it herself.
I think so too. It's too perfect a cliffhanger.
Yes.
Okay, there's a lot of stuff I highlighted in the rest of these chapters, but one thing I do want to talk about particularly is Fanny's question to Sir Thomas about the slave trade. Something has occurred to me that, look, I'm sure this has been said before, but I've just never seen it, which is that she didn't ask him about slavery or the enslaved people on his property or anything like that. She asked him about the slave trade. And I wondered, why did she ask him about the slave trade, which after all is illegal by this time? And I think it's the naval connection, because it was the Navy that was in charge of policing this. And I looked this up. There were only at this time 2 ships actually assigned to the coast of Africa. But we do know that William, he's been in the Mediterranean, then he went to the West Indies, then he was back in the Mediterranean, he was at Gibraltar at some time. So he probably wasn't on one of these 2 ships patrolling the coast of Africa, but there was a naval involvement. And we already know from earlier in that conversation when Mary and Edmund are talking about the clergy and Fanny pipes up out of nowhere how nice the chaplain on William's ship is. She does have this, how does it affect the Navy? What's the impact on the Navy? So I think the context of that question is nothing to do with Sir Thomas's estates in Antigua, but I think it is just tied to her, I won't say obsession with the Navy, but her interest in what's happening in the Navy and what the implications may be for William.
Yes, I think you're absolutely right.
There's been a lot made, probably starting with Said, but other people since, talking about the fact that after she asked the question, there was such a dead silence. And there's probably no point in going into it in great detail because other people have argued all sides of it in great depth. But I guess I tend to read that as being not a dead silence on the part of the novel about slavery, although you could say that there is one, but I don't think that line is significant.
Yes.
I think all she is saying there is that everyone else wasn't interested in that question, and maybe everyone else is just thinking, oh, this is Fanny on about the Navy again.
Yes. I do think, in a sense, there was also another mention of slavery in these chapters, but not one that Jane Austen really expects us to register. And that is in the sentence, his business in Antigua had latterly been prosperously rapid, and he came directly from Liverpool. And then you get a chill, or I got a sort of a chill, when I'm thinking, what is this business that has prospered? Is it about getting better control over the enslaved people, making them work harder, getting more money from them? And I don't think Jane Austen thought that.
No.
But once you're sensitised to what was happening in Antigua, that's the sort of thing the book can make happen.
As we said in our first episode, I absolutely understand that there are some people who will just find they cannot read Mansfield Park because of the slavery connotations, and that is absolutely understandable and no excuse needs to be given for that. What I do have a bit of an issue with is the people who are arguing that that question about the slave trade is a deliberate insertion by Jane Austen to make us think about slavery and thus to show that Mansfield Park is an abolitionist novel, because I don't agree with that position. Again, as we said in much more detail in our first episode.
Yes.
Okay, did you have a favourite sentence?
Yes, I did.
Uh-huh.
The sentence I've chosen is the conclusion that Mr. Yates comes to after he's spent a couple of days living in the house with Sir Thomas. He had known many disagreeable fathers before and often been struck with the inconveniences they occasioned, but never in the whole course of his life had he seen one of that class so unintelligibly moral, so infamously tyrannical as Sir Thomas. And what I sort of feel with a sentence like this is she gets so much into it. You know, she conveys not just what Yates thought, but what Sir Thomas was like, and also what she herself thinks of them. And just in the phrasing, she manages to suggest that Yates is to be regarded as foolish and self-deceiving, and she's puncturing his bubble of self-conceit, and that Sir Thomas has admirable characteristics. Now, I mean, she can do all that in one sentence, and such a beautiful sentence with all sorts of nice cadences and funny exaggerated words. I'm just sort of absolutely amazed at what she can achieve with language.
Okay, well, as usual, I had a bunch of favourite sentences and I'm struggling to choose between them, but I think the one I will go with, well, I'll do a call out to Lady Bertram's lines, as soon as I am a little more at leisure, I mean to look in at their rehearsals too.
Yes.
Who is more at leisure than Lady Bertram? But I think the one I'll choose as my favourite sentence is, the bride was elegantly dressed, the two bridesmaids were duly inferior, her father gave her away, her mother stood with salts in her hand expecting to be agitated, her aunt tried to cry, and the service was impressively read by Dr. Grant. I particularly love the two bridesmaids were duly inferior.
Yes.
It's showing that even in Jane Austen's day, bridezillas obviously existed. But also the fact that her mother stood with salts in hands expecting to be agitated, and her aunt tried to cry. We're getting so much about all of the characters in this single sentence.
Yes.
The character we're talking about today is Sir Thomas, and this is a slightly complicated one to talk about, so I just wanted to lay out some stuff initially, which is that, as we've talked about before, it is virtually undeniable that the estates in Antigua had enslaved people working on them, and therefore Sir Thomas is directly involved with the enslavement of people. And we don't think that this is something that Mansfield Park is about, but it does, to a modern reader, influence our perception of Sir Thomas. So I think in this conversation, we should start out by talking about Sir Thomas as we see him presented in the book, and then at the end look at how we tie this in with his involvement with enslaved people. I think the way we are meant to see Sir Thomas is as someone who is in fact morally upright, but who makes some terrible mistakes. And as I said, it's very hard to reconcile moral uprightness with enslaved people, which is why I think we should hold that bit of the discussion over to the end. And I would also say I'm probably going to be directly or indirectly referring to a blog post by Lona Manning, friend of the podcast, which she calls In Defence of Sir Thomas, because everything I think she has articulated particularly well in this blog post.
What I felt like starting with is to say that the characters in the book have a high opinion of Sir Thomas.
Absolutely.
And is this account given of him to Mary Crawford by Mrs. Grant? You will find his consequence very just and reasonable when you see him in his family. I assure you, I do not think we do so well without him. He has a fine, dignified manner which suits the head of such a house and keeps everybody in their place. And then we've got Mary Crawford running through what she's learnt at Mansfield. My own sister as a wife, Sir Thomas Bertram as a husband, are my standards of perfection. So I think Jane Austen wants us to see that's the outside Sir Thomas, but it's the Sir Thomas as a father and Sir Thomas as an educator that Well, she's really down on him.
Yes.
I mean, she's down on him at the beginning. Then we get the whole middle bit where, in a sense, she wants to give this picture of the dignified Sir Thomas. But then at the end, we've got his emotional collapse when all these things happen with his children.
Yeah.
And she blames him.
And he blames himself. There's a number of good things that we are explicitly shown about him. He's dignified. He's principled. We are told that Lady Bertram gets her views on things from him and therefore she views rightly.
Yeah.
When it comes to taking in Fanny, Mrs. Norris is, let's do it, but he thinks carefully about, a puppy is for life. If we do this thing, we are taking responsibility for not just bringing her up as a gentlewoman, but making sure she continues as such.
Yes.
There's also, of course, in terms of principles, his opposition to the idea of absentee rectors.
Can we let that go for now? Because I've got a lot to say about that in the historical section, and we don't want to repeat it.
Yes, okay.
What she's really interested in is this man with all these good principles and so fond of his children, getting it so wrong.
Yes, he cares about his family, and I do think, I can't remember if I said before, but if we look at his relationship with Lady Bertram, like Mr. Bennet and like Mr. Palmer, he has married someone for her looks and then discovered that she is not going to be an intellectually stimulating companion or an emotional support. But unlike Mr. Bennet and unlike Mr. Palmer, he is invariably courteous to her. And I found one line that I thought was particularly good. It's when Fanny's been asked to dinner with the Grants and Lady Bertram doesn't know what to make of it. So she's going to ask Sir Thomas. He's just come in and he's on his way to his dressing room, but she says, "Sir Thomas, stop a moment, I have something to say to you." And what it says then is, her tone of calm languor, for she never took the trouble of raising her voice, was always heard and attended to. Sir Thomas comes in, she expresses her concern in a very confused way, Edmund explains it, and he very politely basically tells her what to think, but he doesn't undercut her, he's not rude to her, he doesn't seem to hold her in contempt. Now, okay, she's not fingernails down a blackboard like Mrs. Bennet or like Mrs. Palmer, but it's such a different dynamic than we see in the Bennet and the Palmer marriages. Although for another side of this, a while back there was a comment on our Facebook page from Bethany, who pointed out the line from later in the book, it might occur to him that Mr. Crawford had been sitting by her long enough, or he might mean to recommend her as a wife by showing her persuadableness. And that is a suggestion that one of the things he values in Lady Bertram is her persuadableness. So maybe it is ingrained in him.
He likes biddable people.
Yeah, he likes biddable people, which is maybe not a terribly wonderful reflection on him. And I'm very grateful to Bethany for drawing my attention to it because it wasn't something I'd thought of.
The thing I find most fascinating with Sir Thomas is that Jane Austen is showing him in his failure with his children, he got it wrong. And I feel that his problem with the principle is almost partly this distinction between principles and decorum. As I was trying to say when I was talking about him and the theatricals, Jane Austen doesn't think acting is wrong, and Sir Thomas lets his children go to plays, but it's the decorum of it. And I think he makes that mistake with his girls. He thinks, I will give them principles, but all that happens is they get scared of him. So they grow up thinking him as a sort of an ogre, and also that he wants them to do things that are sort of really fuddy-duddy, and so they don't make any real distinction between what he would disapprove of as decorous behaviour and these principles he wants them to get. And so they've muddled up decorum with principle, and they haven't made this distinction. But the other real problem is instead of having a happy home, it's turned into one that's just dead boring and they want to get away. Particularly after he comes back and they've had those years of freedom.
Because what it says, he was not outwardly affectionate, and the reserve of his manner repressed all the flow of their spirits before him. And then when he's leaving for Antigua, It says their father was no object of love to them. He had never seemed the friend of their pleasure, and his absence was unhappily most welcome. They were relieved by it from all restraint. So this is the word that keeps referring restraint. He's putting restraint on them. A little while ago, I watched a video on YouTube by Dr. Octavia Cox, where she basically sees Sir Thomas as a very authoritarian, controlling person. I don't think she uses the word, but almost tyrannical. Dr. Cox says, and I don't think we should easily dismiss the narrative voice in these two descriptions of Maria Bertram and Julia Bertram thinking about their marriages, and she comments on the repetition of words and the idea of restraint and Julia's increased dread of her father. But I think what it is we're seeing their perception of him, and how is that perception different from any teenage girl who has a curfew, any teenage girl who is snuck out of the house to go to a party? As you say, decorum and propriety are kind of combined, and he has stricter views of decorum than perhaps the Austen family did.
And than Mrs. Norris's had.
Yes. So they would use words like controlling. Their attitude is still the teenage girl who's been under some level of control by their parents. And I don't think it's not a reflection on authoritarianism, which I think is another thing Dr. Cox says, the power dynamics within the household. I don't think we're meant to take it as Sir Thomas abusing those power dynamics. On the other side to that is his scene with Maria when he realises what Mr. Rushworth is like as a person. He doesn't believe Maria can be happy with him. We actually get quite a lot about Sir Thomas in this passage because we see him genuinely being kind to Maria, and it's not dissimilar to Mr. Bennet encouraging Lizzie to refuse Darcy, in that he is trying to make her see that just because she'll be rich, will that make her happy? And he says he will bear the brunt of breaking off the engagement, which would actually be quite troublesome.
It would be a difficult thing to do.
Yes.
It would expose them to sort of gossip.
Yeah. But at the same time, we also see in this scene one of his slightly less admirable properties, which is that he does place a certain amount of emphasis on money. He does actually see it as a good connection. And when Maria says, I want to go through with this, he is actually quite pleased.
I think we can take into account it's quite as much political pleasure as financial pleasure. Yeah. A young man belonging to the same interests that he would simply nurture up.
Yeah. He's also, of course, thinking that it means Maria will probably spend more time with her family. So he likes that side of it as well. So, which is
one of the terribly sad things, that he thought he was creating this lovely family circle.
Yeah.
And in fact, the only one of his children who ever wanted to be around him was Edmund, whereas his other three children just didn't want it to be there.
This is where I'd like to again refer to Lona Manning's article, because she pointed out something that hadn't occurred to me, which is at the end of the book, when we get all these reflections on the mistakes made in the education of Maria and Julia, Sir Thomas blames himself for it. But what Lona Manning points out is that Austen devotes more space to Sir Thomas in her concluding chapter than to any other character, including Fanny. She goes through that final chapter. I won't read out what she says, but I will put a link to her post. That final chapter is so focused on his self-recrimination. I don't think that's a picture of a villain who has been reformed. That is of a morally upright, principled, decorous person who realises he's made mistakes and is beating himself up about it.
Yes, though on this most recent read-through I did feel that, my goodness, she's really having a go at Sir Thomas here at the end. There's just a possibility that what she's also doing is putting it up as a warning to households not to be too strict, not to be too constraining, for parents to think that their children might like a bit more enjoyment than they'll give them.
But of course, the other thing with Sir Thomas is that it's pretty much undeniable that his property in Antigua had enslaved people working on it, and when he went to Antigua, he would have had a direct connection with them. And if you want to say that nothing else that he does, no matter how good and how upright, can excuse that, well, it's really hard to disagree with. And if this makes it impossible for you to engage with Sir Thomas as a character, then that is absolutely your right. As we've said before, different people have different lines on what they can accept when reading a book from another historical period. But I don't think, and I think you don't think either, that this should colour how Sir Thomas is being presented by Jane Austen.
And in a sense, how she expected her first readers to respond to what she's saying.
Yes. I've said before how the 1999 film version turns Sir Thomas into a full-on, almost cartoon-like villain, which really doesn't work for me. And I also mentioned earlier Dr. Octavia Cox's very, very negative perception of Sir Thomas. And I feel that these perspectives on him really rather pervert the character that Jane Austen has given us in Sir Thomas. Again, mentioning Lona Manning, she makes the point that if you're trying to position Mansfield Park as an abolitionist text, which she and we don't think it is, but if you're trying to say it has a strong abolitionist message, then you really can't see Sir Thomas as a moral centre to the novel. So you have to position him quite differently. But we don't think the text supports that kind of reading, because we do think he's presented as terribly, terribly mistaken in a lot of things he does.
But mistaken largely in his practice, not in the principles he stands for.
And as Lona has pointed out, the enslavement of people is not one of the things he berates himself for at the end of the book when he's reflecting on all the mistakes he made. So if you're trying to reconcile what's in the book with the fact that Sir Thomas must have had direct engagement with enslaved people, I don't think the way to do that is just to say that everything about him is evil. In fact, I'd like to make a comparison with the TV series The Sopranos, where Tony Soprano, the main character, he's this ruthless mob leader, but the program is really focusing more on his home life and his emotional turmoils, the things that are going wrong in his family. And all the way through, you have to reconcile the fact that at one moment you empathise with him for all these family and emotional problems he has, and then at the next moment you see him engaged in all these horrible actions. And I just think that's kind of the same thing. But of course, the big difference with Mansfield Park is that we aren't shown any of this really disturbing side of Sir Thomas. We need to bring that in from our own knowledge of the period, which is the same as we have to do with the fact that all of this misery that existed at the time that Jane Austen just doesn't mention.
When we talked about slavery, we talked about the whole of British society being complicit in slavery, that Sir Thomas is only part of this complicity that applies to everyone.
Yeah, the only difference is that we know he actually has been to Antigua, so it's not just theoretical for him.
For the historical background for this week, I'm going to look at certain aspects of the clergy. In particular, the meaning or what is implied by certain topics that have been brought up, like the presentation of a living or taking orders. The first time I gave one of these talks on Jane Austen's clergy, when we were discussing Pride and Prejudice, I issued the warning that I might have got things wrong, that what I said was based mainly on bits and pieces picked up from novels. This time I can speak with much more certainty. A few months ago, Susanna Fullerton, who's president of the Jane Austen Society of Australia, gave a little talk on her Jane Austen library and recommended a book called Jane Austen and the Clergy by Irene Collins. I immediately ordered a copy and was relieved to find that I seemed to have got everything more or less right in what I'd said before, and that Irene Collins also explained more fully things like the commutation of tithes that I was unclear about. So the first one I'm going to talk about is the presentation of livings. The parsons in Jane Austen's novels, when they were appointed priests of their parishes, they became, until they died or retired, the owners of the church, the parsonage, and the farmland known as the glebe that went with them, and any other endowments that had been made. They held these in much the same way as Mr. Bennet held his entailed estate. They could occupy them and make money out of them, but they couldn't sell them. Most of their income, however, came from tithes. according to a custom going far back into the medieval period, they were entitled to 1/10 of the annual produce of the parish. It was known as a tithe, which meant a tenth. In the preceding centuries, the actual produce was collected by the rector and often stored in huge tithe barns. But by the end of the 1700s, usually the produce was commuted to a cash payment, which was negotiated each year on what the produce of the year had been. Now, during the 1700s, there was the agricultural revolution, and so the improvement in agriculture led to a rise in the value of produce, and so to a rise in the tithes. Previously, the clergyman had been from somewhere local who'd got scholarships and gone to the university and then moved off to a living that gave him £50 to £150 a year. As the tithes went up, the amount of income from the living went up. And so by the middle of the century, you're starting to get young men of property thinking, well, I could do with an extra 200 a year, an extra 300 a year, I'll be a clergyman. Now, the presentation of most of the country livings was in the gift of a patron, who in Jane Austen's novels is usually the major landowner of the parish. On the other hand, a landowner like Sir Thomas Bertram, whose estate covered a number of parishes, might have several livings in his gift. The parish of Steventon, where Jane Austen grew up, had been presented to her father in 1761 by his distant relation Thomas Knight, who had huge estates in Kent and in Hampshire, and that allowed him to provide for a large number of relatives and friends. Quite often, however, as in the case of the Bertrams, the landowner might decide that a country living would provide a good income for one of his younger sons. And so, when the current incumbent died, the landowner would then present the living to a trusted clerical friend on the clear understanding he would resign when the patron wanted to take over the parish for his son. This was what had happened at Thornton Lacey. It already had somebody holding it for him, and what Sir Thomas had intended to do with Mansfield when Mr. Norris died. On the other hand, these livings were seen by people with money to invest as a good way of providing for children and other dependents, and it became seen as quite reputable and legally recognised for patrons to sell the presentation to someone with an ordained clergyman to provide for. They couldn't buy it themselves. You weren't allowed to. Somebody else had to buy the presentation for you, even if, in fact, it was your money.
Okay. So Dr. Grant wouldn't have bought it himself. Someone would have bought it and given it to Dr. Grant.
Yet,
but that purchase was just for the life of Dr. Grant. It wasn't a forever.
No,
right.
Though it might have been possible to buy something forever.
Uh-huh. But we know that in this case it was just for the life of Dr. Grant.
We definitely know, yes. This, interestingly, had also happened to Jane Austen's father. According to Irene Collins, in 1700, after he'd been settled at Steventon for 9 years, his increasingly rich Uncle Francis bought the presentation of the neighbouring parishes of Dean and Ash. I mean, these were not a long way away. They were sort of linked up to Steventon and obviously weren't in the power of the Knight relation. Apparently they were assuming that the Ash parish would fall vacant soonest, but in fact it was the parish of Dean that became vacant, and his uncle presented it to Jane Austen's father. I think we have to see the presentation of livings as part of the same sort of thing as the use of interest in the civil service and naval appointments, like the sale of army commissions and like vote buying in elections, as one of the practices that today are seen as totally unacceptable, but that appeared quite normal and even principled to Jane Austen. The main charges levelled against this way of appointing parish priests were that it led to pluralism and to non-residence, and also the appointment of a whole lot of very lazy clergymen. Jane Austen is not recorded as disapproving of her father and her brother being pluralists and holding more than one living. And she sees it actually as a sort of happy chance that Edmund and Fanny can add the income and presumably the responsibilities of the Mansfield living to those of Thornton Lacey and move back close to the park. As far as she's concerned, no problems there.
I wonder if it's sort of a case of if you're just absentee, you're being lazy, you're not fulfilling your responsibilities as a clergyman. But with pluralism, you are fulfilling your responsibilities, but for a part of your responsibilities, you're delegating because...
To a curate.
Yeah, to a curate, because you need this extra living so that you can live in the style to which you're accustomed.
Well, that, I think, is pretty much the case with her father. Dean was right next door to Steventon, and they were both really quite small parishes. But there was definitely a lot of pressure against this, only 20 years after Jane Austen died, which means when Fanny and Edmund were in the height of their marriage, there was definitely an act passed called the Pluralities Act of 1838. And this decreed that no one could hold more than 2 livings, and they must be within 10 miles of each other. Well, that would have been all right for Jane Austen's father, but where was Thornton Lacey?
It actually says in the book, Thornton Lacey is 8 miles from Mansfield. So even after this act comes in, if Edmund is at Mansfield, Thornton Lacey is still within that boundary.
But Jane Austen makes no objections to pluralism.
Yeah.
On the other hand, Mansfield Park shows that she was very much aware of another of the criticisms levelled against the system. Once installed and with a guaranteed income, the incumbent could give as much or as little time as he chose to his parish. The Crawfords, with their cynical urban view of the clergy, bring this up. We've got Mary very strongly disapproving of the self-indulgence it encouraged. It is indolence, Mr. Bertram, indeed indolence and love of ease. His curate does all the work, and the business of his own life is to dine. Henry, on the other hand, seems to absolutely approve of a system that allows a younger son to enjoy the same freedoms as his older brother. I apprehend he will not have less than 700 a year. 700 a year is a fine thing for a younger brother. And as, of course, he'll still live at home, it will be all for his minute plaisir. And a sermon at Christmas and Easter, I suppose, will be the sum total of sacrifice.
Yes, it's like he takes it just absolutely for granted that Edmund will continue to live at home and only drop in on the parish occasionally.
But this picture of Edmund's future life is definitely not accepted by Sir Thomas. He believed, as no doubt the Austen parsons also did, that the acceptance of a living absolutely implied moral, if not legal, obligations. As he says to Edmund, a parish has wants and claims which can be known only by a clergyman constantly resident, and which no proxy can be capable of satisfying to the same extent. That's more or less what I want to say about the presentation of livings.
Yeah.
In a later session, when I talk about Edmund's ordination, I'll try to spell out more fully what I think he thought these wants and claims were, and also why he believed the parish priests were, as he told Mary Crawford, entrusted with the guardianship of religion and morals. Mary Crawford really didn't know all that much about a possible clergyman's career. You know, she says there's no room for ambition. And of course there was. A clergyman who worked hard and politicked hard could get himself promoted as high up as a bishop, and quite a large number of bishops actually sat in the House of Lords.
So that means it's theoretically possible, if he were a different sort of personality, that Edmund could actually end up higher in the social structure than Tom.
Yes, than Tom. Yes.
As I said last time, the theatricals do feature in all of the pop culture, and particularly the adaptations and modernisations of Mansfield Park. The 1983 version with Sylvester Latouzil and Nicholas Farrell, they actually fit in quite a lot of excerpts from Lover's Vows itself in the rehearsals. They've actually got the text of Lover's Vows. So they have a scene between the rhyming butler played by Tom and the Baron. There's a speech by Count Cassel where he talks about what he's learned in all the different countries he's travelled to.
Yeah.
And then Amelia asks him what country teaches of love.
Oh, my goodness.
A speech that I'm sure Mr. Rushworth would have great difficulty with.
But they put that into the film.
That scene is him trying to learn the speech and Fanny helping him.
Yes.
They have Frederick and Agatha's first meeting. They have a bit of the Anne Holt and Amelia scene, and they have a scene with the Baron. Just a couple of things they do with them. When they have Maria and Henry rehearsing, they have the lines that Frederick and Agatha have in their very first meeting, and they embrace, which would of course be part of the script, and then they kiss, which would of course not be part of the script.
Yes.
Even more interestingly, when Edmund and Mary are rehearsing Anne Holt and Amelia with Fanny assisting, they start out very uncomfortable. They're not looking at each other, they're looking straight ahead. But as they progress through the scene, they start engaging with each other. So I thought that was quite nicely done. Then, as we know in the book, what they're doing when Sir Thomas arrives home, there's no, I think, real suggestion in the book that this is a full dress rehearsal or anything.
I don't know if it could have been because Fanny, she's still got to be making Mr. Rushworth's cloak.
Yes, but in this one it is a dress rehearsal, but they haven't actually started the rehearsal when Julia comes in. And then it plays out more or less as in the book, except that Tom, Edmund and Mr. Rushworth all follow Sir Thomas when he goes to the theatre. After that, though, they don't have the scene where Sir Thomas offers to get Maria out of the engagement. They've just cut that completely. They've also cut Fanny's question about the slave trade.
But that was before it became an issue.
Well, this was 1983, so yes.
Yes.
The 1999 version with Frances O'Connor and Johnny Lee Miller, as I think I said last time, they've completely excised the Julia and Maria jockeying for the part of Agatha. So Maria is playing Agatha, but Julia is still involved in it. We have a rehearsal montage. They're still reading from the script, but they're in costume. The costuming is very confused because the men are wearing ruffs, but the women are not wearing Elizabethan clothing. So I don't know what's happening with the costuming there. But in that rehearsal montage, Julia sees Henry and Maria embracing, which obviously upsets her. But this montage is intercut with a carriage, Sir Thomas arriving home. And Fanny is actually the first to see him when he arrives home.
Yes.
But in this material that comes after the play, it goes quite off book and adds in some extra stuff, but it also rearranges things quite a lot. You know, one of its big things it wants to talk about is slavery and also the subservience of women. And so you have Sir Thomas talking about the enslaved people and says some really offensive things which Edmund tries to contradict. And Fanny says she has been reading Clarkson under Edmund's guidance.
All right.
Look, I found it quite heavy-handed, and as I've said before, they make in this production Sir Thomas an unredeemable villain. And I feel that is... It's an unsophisticated way of dealing with it. We haven't got to Maria's wedding yet, but Sir Thomas suddenly says he's going to have a ball. Fanny doesn't want to have a ball, and she goes out riding in the rain, having said to Edmund she will not be sold off like a slave. So it's just, as I said, I find it heavy-handed and unsubtle and not particularly insightful. It doesn't seem to go much beyond the level of saying slavery is bad, which I don't think we need a film to tell us that fact. This one doesn't have Henry Crawford leaving after the play. He's still there, and he has already started to show some interest in Fanny before Maria's wedding. And I'm going to be talking about this a bit more in our next episode, but essentially Maria is prompted to go to her father about the wedding when she's seen Henry showing interest in Fanny. Sir Thomas does offer to get her out of it, but she says no, she wants the wedding to be in a fortnight. So then we have the 2007 version with Billy Piper and Blake Ritson. Once again, they're all in costume as they're doing the rehearsing. This time the costuming seems to make a little bit more sense. It seems like maybe late 17th century, early 18th century costuming,
Yes.
which feels better. We have a scene where Henry entices Maria to the stage behind the curtain with a not from the book line about, "Are we not made for each other? Tonight I can be only one thing, Maria. Tonight I am your lover or I am nothing." And I think that is maybe just put there to make things very obvious for the watcher. Then they kiss, of course, and then the curtain is pulled down so everyone sees them embracing. Obviously, Julia's unhappy. Now, Fanny also has been hearing Mr. Rushworth rehearse his lines. I think, again, he may be having trouble with the line about where he learned what. Then Tom tells Fanny to play the cottager's wife. And this one, again, intercuts the carriage. So then it cuts to the carriage. Then we have Fanny being handed the script and taken on stage. Then Sir Thomas walks into the room and everyone's on stage. And honestly, the stage is tiny because with all the cast plus Fanny on there, there's no space. So
they're elbow to elbow.
They're not just elbow to elbow, they're shoulder to shoulder.
Yeah.
And this one, again, without trying to do a heavy-handed slavery is bad like 1999 did, they also chose not to completely ignore it as 1983 did. In this case, rather than Fanny asking about the slave trade, Fanny asks if now that he has experienced it, Sir Thomas believes slavery can prosper in the same way. And Sir Thomas says we can do well without slavery, but without order we are lost. Which I think they're trying to tread a line without denying the existence of enslaved people in Antigua. They are trying to handwave away Sir Thomas's complicitness in it.
Yes.
Which 1999 did not do, but I felt went too far in the other direction.
Yes.
So again, in this version, Sir Thomas does tell Maria that they can cancel the wedding, and she says, no, let's go ahead with it. And Henry Crawford is still there at the time of the wedding.
That sounds odd to have him still hanging around.
Yes, it is interesting that in both the 1999 and the 2007 version, as part of their effort to compress the time frame, they don't have Henry Crawford going away and then coming back again. 2014, the web series modernisation from Mansfield with Love. In this one, as I said last time, they're not doing a play, they're making a film. It's called Lover's Vows. Yates allegedly wrote it, and everyone says how terrible the script is.
Oh.
The equivalent of the big rehearsal scene is they're doing some stuff outdoors in the grounds of Mansfield Park, which, as you remember, is a hotel. And Frankie is just doing some sort of behind-the-scenes footage. And at one point, she's talking to the camera about it, and in the background, you see Henry and Rhea, and they're kissing, and Frankie notices, and she's horrified, and she races away, and she wants to tell Ed about it, but Ed is distracted with what they're doing, so he can't talk to her. So what you were saying before about how odd it is that in the book, Fanny never even talks to Edmund about what she's seen with Henry and Maria. In this, she tries to talk to him about it, and she gets dismissed. Another callback to the play. You remember I said some of the earlier adaptations include this speech from Count Cassel about what he learned in every different country.
Yes.
They've got an equivalent speech in this film. And of course, he's struggling with getting the lines right because you've got to remember what country and what thing you learned in each one. And that's...
Oh, right. Yeah.
You cannot possibly imagine Mr. Rushworth being able to do that. And that's the thing that all of these adaptations pick up on. And of course, while they are doing this stuff out in the grounds and doing some filming, that's when Mr. Bertram comes back, their father, and is very angry. And you actually have a scene where you hear him in the background shouting to Tom about sort of bringing disrepute onto the hotel and the business. And after that, Henry goes back to London because, as Mary says, he gets bored easily.
Yes.
The other thing we get is... we have some filming done at the wedding. And it's during this that we actually get the equivalent of Sir Thomas offering to get Maria out of the wedding. This actually happens on the wedding day, but it does sound like it's been part of an ongoing conversation where he's saying he imagined her married to someone else and she's insisting that she loves Rory Rushworth. All of these productions have fun with the theatricals.
Yes.
They don't get the level of comedy Jane Austen gets into it with all the different egos clashing. I think what they focus on, and I thought it was a good line actually in From Mansfield with Love, where they felt that Lover's Vows was a big bubble of tension waiting to pop. And that I think is... all of these earlier adaptations, that's what they were focusing on, the tension it's creating, the interpersonal tensions, but not the comedy side of it.
Yes.
You've been listening to the Reading Jane Austen podcast with me, Harriet.
And me, Ellen. In our next episode, we'll be looking at chapters 22 to 25 of Mansfield Park.
The structure of this podcast was inspired by Harry Potter and the Sacred Text. Our music is Creative Commons performances of pieces Jane Austen might have listened to.
You can find us on Facebook at Reading Jane Austen and our website readingjaneausten.com.
You can email us at readingjaneausten.com or rate and review us in your podcast app. We hope you'll join us next time.